Hi everyone, welcome back. It's Melissa. Today I'm going to share my complete eyeshadow palette collection. So this does not necessarily include like any trios or smaller quads. These are just like bigger palettes for the most part. I do know there are a few smaller ones in there, but that's all right. This is just how we're going to go. And I have it arranged mostly by brand, because I thought that made the most sense to me to go through and share what I have by brand, and then I'll have a couple like one-offs. I have some miscellaneous palettes that I only have one of, so we'll include those as well and talk about what next steps will be for decluttering, because I do want to declutter this collection a little further. But I want to continue to do it in a thoughtful manner, so I'll share that in a later video. So I'm going to relocate to the floor because that way I can get the best up-close shots for you guys to see the palettes, even though a lot of these you probably have already seen or already are familiar with. It's still fun to see what they look like and how much use they've gotten. Some of the older ones actually have some pan showing, and a lot of them don't, to be very honest. So we're going to move to the floor and get after it. So I'm going to start off with this little basket. This is kind of where my palette obsession began, and it started with the OG Naked palette. And I saw this, I remember vividly seeing this in a magazine and thinking, wow, look how beautiful that is. I need that in my life. That's where my love of YouTube started, because I got it and then I was like, oh, well, now what do I do with this? And I went online and started watching beauty tutorials. This is what started it all for me. And I have like a real love of this palette, even though I rarely use it because it's quite old, although I still feel like it's pretty fine. I also have this Naked Smoky, which is one of my favorite palettes that they've put out. And it was very controversial because not everybody liked this palette. They had a lot of negative things to say about it, particularly this purple, but I loved it, and it was pretty much a cool tone palette, which I also loved. And it had quite a few matte shadows down here, which I also loved. There was a lot that I loved about this palette. I also have the Naked 3, which I think this is... Here, let's cover this mirror up a little bit. I loved the mauve tones in this palette. I just thought it was so beautiful and just really spoke to me. So I was super happy when this one came out, and I loved it. I never did end up with the Naked 2. Kate had it, so I was able to play around with it, but I never ended up purchasing it. I did, however, get this little Naked 2 Basics palette, which I think is a really underrated palette. I think these little Naked Basics, they look so basic that people are like, meh, not terribly exciting, but actually they're super exciting and you can really do so much with them. I thought they were brilliant and not surprising. I think this is the only one that's still on the market, the original Naked, which I did have. A little too warm tone for me, but I passed it on to Kate and she used it up. But this one was cool toned and I loved that. During my obsession with Urban Decay, they came out with the Smoked palette, which I was like, well, I'm in love with all of these palettes. Let me go ahead and get this one too. This one was very interesting for me because I thought it was going to be a little bit more colorful, but these three shadows have like a black base, and when you apply them to the eye, the color kind of becomes secondary and that black base really shows through. So I was a little bit disappointed in it, but like Mushroom is awesome, and these like neutrals, yeah, there was some great looks in this palette. And then one year I picked up one of the Vice palettes. I thought this one was pretty spectacular. It was my first really big palette. I loved how they had, you know, kind of like a color story in each row. There was a lot you could do with this palette, and I enjoyed this palette quite a bit, and I used it quite a lot. But like everything else, you get other new favorites and then it goes by the wayside. Next, I'm going to move on to Lorac. After getting the Urban Decay Naked palette, I think I picked up this palette next. And this is the original Lorac Pro palette. my love for this palette is still undying. I think it's one of the best palettes on the market. I think their layout where there's mattes up top and shimmers on the bottom is brilliant, and their color range is extremely wearable in here. I often, back in the day, recommended this as a great entry, like starter palette for people because it's so easy to understand. I'm pretty sure this is the second Pro palette. And again, I bought it because of the strength of the original Pro palette, and I thought there was some really gorgeous colors in here. I loved this green, this dark blue, this plum. I just thought nice pops of color, fun to play with, and enjoyed this one quite a bit. This is Lorac Pro 3, and a very neutral palette, but a great palette. A lot of people thought this was boring, but you know, more and more as I look at what I reach for on a day-to-day basis, it's a more neutral palette because it's hard to wear very colorful looks to work and not look strange. So this I thought was a great palette too, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. This is the Lorac Pro 4 palette, and to be honest, I barely have used this palette, and it's one that I'll probably dive into pretty early on as I'm starting my next palette project because I want to see what I think about it. Right now I have it in my collection on the strength of these 3 other palettes, but I just am not sure what I think about that. So this is something to be considered in the long run. And then somewhere in between all of those, they released this Nude Basics palette. Yeah, it's just a bunch of nudes. And I thought this was a great little palette for, you know, work and, you know, if you just want a real basic look. But this did not last long on the market. It was on and off the market really quickly. I don't think it was received very well. This next basket has all Anastasia Beverly Hills. I think I started off making my own little palette. Does this really count? I don't know. It is mixed in with all these others, and so here you have it. I think I had wanted a palette, like one of their bigger palettes. They weren't in stock, and me being me wasn't going to leave empty-handed. I really wanted to try the formula, so I put this little palette together. But what I discovered is I'm not really great at putting little palettes together. I think this was the palette that I was originally after, and I did find it at a later date. It was restocked. This is the Master Palette by Mario, and people raved about this palette. And to be very frank, I was a little disappointed in it. It is so warm-toned, it was very hard for me to wear. So the next palette I got after that from this brand was the Modern Renaissance. You know, people have a lot to say about this. I think this was the first palette to kick off like the red tone shadow trend, because you see a lot of red tones in this palette. And I found I really had to work hard and figure this palette out, how to use those red tones and how to ground them so that they didn't look like I had an eye infection. And I did a whole video on this palette, and I'll include a link to it in case you're interested for my tips and tricks with this palette. So I'm not sure which came next, Subculture or Sultry. I'm going to talk about Subculture. Again, another very controversial palette. I loved the grungy look of these shadows, and I was so excited to get my hands on it. It wasn't a palette that I used very much. My excitement for it was huge, and I think it just maybe wasn't the right color story for me. And there was so much controversy about the formula in this palette that it was very powdery. There was a lot of problems with this palette. Prior to this, ABH could do no wrong. Okay, the Sultry palette. This is one of my favorites from this brand. I love everything about this palette. And I'll include a link to the video I did on this palette because it is just such a great wearable palette. There's so many directions you can go, so many great eye looks that you can do. And I think this shade here, it was very misunderstood, and I found it to be a very brightening shade. It was awesome to put in the crease, to layer with other colors. It really was a very smart color, and I think people just wrote it off, or they tried to use it as a single like accent color, and it doesn't really work that way. One of my all-time favorite palettes. And then the last in this group is the Jackie Aina collaboration. At the time, felt like I wanted a little color to work with. And again, I found this color, the colors here, to be a little on the warm side and a little tricky for me to use, although this shade here is brilliant. So brilliant. But this is one that I honestly should have given a little bit more time to work with and explore, but I gave up pretty quickly on it. Okay, Marc Jacobs. I obviously have quite a love of this brand and this eyeshadow formula. I think this was my first one. I don't think they put them in these little pouches anymore, although I'm glad that it has a little pouch because my latch broke. So this is the Lolita palette, and it is a great neutral palette. I really enjoyed the shades in this. Very highly wearable, great to travel with, a really great palette. So next up is the Frivolux palette, which is a beautiful palette with a lot of taupes in it. That's a fun little color to work in with all these others. So I've really enjoyed this palette a lot. This was a great purchase. This is the Editorial. Another awesome palette. Great neutrals, a pop of green, just so many fun things to play with this. And I can remember going out with a friend one night for dinner, and we're sitting there with our husbands with us, and she's like, oh, I really like your eyeshadow today. I had worn a lot of the green, and I said, thank you. I said, it's the Marc Jacobs Editorial. We always talk makeup. And she's like, that's what I'm wearing too. It was hilarious. And this is their limited edition Stiletto palette. This is another great neutrals and a little like of a taupey shimmer here. Another very solid and pretty palette from Marc Jacobs. We're going to jump into some Bobbi Brown. I love me some Bobbi Brown. I think their shadows are solid, and no one does a neutral like Bobbi Brown does. This palette here was one that I rediscovered during my Lucky Bag series, and the one that I probably had not even swatched, or maybe only swatched, and then I started using it, and it is one of my all-time favorites. It's just perfect. Some grays, some browns, they're neutrals, the little sparkle. It does it all. This is like my go-to, always appropriate. It was limited edition. Let's see what else I have in here. So this little palette, I'm not really sure. I think this came with like a little try me kit, and it's got a blush. Let me remove that. It's got a blush and like a trio. This is a great palette to travel with because it is literally the size of a credit card. This palette was their Navy and Nudes palette, and there's a little slide out there. I adore this palette. This is just, again, one of those great palettes to travel with, because you have great neutrals, a little bit of sparkle, you have this dark navy that you can smoke it up with or use as a liner. It's fantastic. I was so excited when I saw this release come out, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. This very shiny one is called I think it's called the Ultraviolets palette, and it was a limited edition holiday palette. I didn't actually purchase this. This was handed down to me by my girlfriend who bought it, and the formula just did not agree with her, and so she did pass that along to me, and I've probably only used this a handful of times. So now we're going to talk about some Viseart. This was my first one that I ever picked up. This is the Paris Nudes palette. Very shimmery. I was attracted to it because it has two like of these lavenderish shades along with some great neutrals. This is a fun little palette to use, but it is, I think almost all of it is shimmer, so it probably really realistically needs to be paired with a palette that is a little bit more matte. And I fell in love with the formula. This is the original Cool Mattes. My love for this palette is enormous. I think it's really great. I actually like the colors in this better than I like it in the second Cool Mattes that they put out. This just appeals to me more. This is one of their little Theory palettes. I think they started releasing some of these smaller palettes to help bring the price point down, so that it opened up their brand to some people who couldn't afford these bigger palettes. And this one, I believe, is the Cashmere palette. All right, let's go on to IT Cosmetics. This is the Naturally Pretty palette. I remember seeing this in the store and like looking at it several times and looking at it and trying to decide, do I want it? Should I get it? I could not get it out of my head, in which case I finally decided, girl, you should get it. You can't stop thinking about it. And it is up there with one of my top top palettes. I think it's gorgeous. A lot of great mid-tone colors in here. You know, the Transformer shade I could live without. I don't think it adds anything to it, but I love all these mid-tones. You can do a great one and done look with this. It's awesome. So shiny. But it has all this glitter in here, and it's loose and it travels. It's so pretty. This is a pretty all-in-one little palette that has a great cheek shade, that has a little bit of a highlighted section there, and, you know, a little bit more neutrals with dark shades here, and these are a little bit warmer. Great little palette. All right, we're going to talk about Tarte next. I'm going to kick it off with this one. This is the Aqua Lilies palette. If you've been around my channel for a while, you know my love for this palette is just undying. It was my first all-in-one palette like this. I think it's fantastic. I will never get rid of this palette because, in my opinion, it's one of the most perfect palettes of all time. I just love it. Based on the strength I felt on this palette, I ended up getting a bunch of other round ones. By now, I've decluttered a lot of them. I believe this one is the Rainforest After Dark palette, which is another beautiful one. This is the Rainforest of the Sea palette. I think it's the original one, which had a very different formula, but I liked it. I thought it was a solid palette, but whoa, look at that packaging. That is spectacular. I think it rivals the Aqua Lilies. So this little guy was a limited edition. It's Golden Days and Sultry Nights. This is one that I talked about in the Lucky Bag recap as one that I probably would have pitched, but then I, ended up using it, and I really love this palette. Particularly love this shade here. It's brilliant. It's like the perfect cool tone, neutral, crease, transition shade, and these are all very solid colors. So I'm glad I held on to that. Next up is the Tartelette palette. I love the way this one and the next one is laid out because it's all organized by row. You have these dark shades that you can use as liners. It's like a complete color story each line, and one's warm, one's cool, and one's like a little mauvey. This is such a wonderful, well thought out palette. I really respect this so much. I have similar feelings about this Tartelette Pro palette as well, for many of the same reasons as I mentioned here. They are very much set up, but in a color story by row. These are all your like super fun shimmery shades, and these are like liner shades. So if you cover those up, those are like really terrific color stories. You can build a look out of that. Add these if you want to touch a shimmer. It's kind of a no-brainer. So well thought out. I really feel like these two palettes never got as much love as I think they deserved, because I think they're really smart palettes. Let's talk about Fenty. Talk about this one first. This was one of her first eyeshadow palette releases. It was a holiday release. It's all super glittery and sparkly, kind of a fun palette to play around with, but not one that I'm going to reach for very often. And then she recently released these snap palettes that can snap together, or you can keep them separate. This first one is Cool Neutrals, and it actually reminds me a little bit of that Marc Jacobs palette because of this purple in there. Just a really pretty solid little color story. And this one is the Smoky palette, which obviously is for a smoky eye. It can be a brown smoky eye. It can be more of a gray tone smoky eye. But I also thought maybe these two would play together nicely. And I think that was the thought for these little palettes. You personalize your color story. All right, let's talk about Natasha Denona. I have a couple of her little minis, and these I think were also, are released because her price point is pretty high, and this allows people to experiment with the formula at a lower price point. So let's see. This first one is the Mini Star palette. Great formula, great color stories. Really beautiful, so I'm going to move through them pretty quickly. This one is the Mini Glam palette, and this one is the Mini Lila palette. Such fun colors down here. This is the Glam palette that was just released. A lot of people said it was cool toned, and I bought it off the strength of what they said, but there's a little bit of warmth there, so it's not entirely cool. The funny thing about this palette was the way it was laid out. And I think she was trying to help people use it by labeling things as center eyelid or outer eyelid, and the internet exploded with their hatred for that. It just doesn't work across all skin tones. What is cool about this palette is they have holes here so you could poke the shadow out, rearrange them into a smaller, like a Z palette, or even rearrange them here within this palette. I have recently developed quite a love affair with ColourPop. In no particular order, that's taupe is one of them. Who doesn't love a beautiful taupe palette? Making Mauves. Who doesn't like a great mauve palette? This looks good on so many different skin tones and hair colors. Beautiful. Flutterby, which is an awesome palette. Someone gave me this little hint. This is like a glitter and was falling out. They said, put a little Band-Aid on there and cover that up to help control the glitter. So that's what's going on there. The Fame palette, which I actually kind of forgot I had, so I'm glad to see this. I want to give that a go again. And the Stone Cold Fox palette, which is, I don't have words for this. It's so beautiful. And actually think it might be better than the Natasha Denona Glam palette. You didn't hear me say that. Here's some Bare Minerals. This is a little quad that was a springtime release. I really loved this shade. This was a new formula, Bounce and Blur, in the shade Dawn. It's just all right. I wouldn't write home about that. This was a holiday release that I absolutely adored. So it had these great neutrals and a full face on this. Loved this. All right, let's talk about Laura Mercier. This is one of my older palettes. You know, it was part of the big three that I had originally. I had Laura Mercier, Lorac Pro, and the Urban Decay. And this African Violet shade is everything. Such a super wonderful palette. One of the following like holidays, I bought this palette. And again, nice solid palette. Not as great as this though. All right, let's talk about Too Faced. This is the Natural Eyes palette. Again, a very solid palette. A lot of people had it and loved it and used the heck out of it. And the original Chocolate Bar palette, I have one of the ones in the big thick tin. Great palette. And again, I love this little accent. And it was one of the first ones that had the chocolate smell to it. This is a NARS little mini palette, and God Created Woman was just a very pretty little palette. This is Hot Nights. It was a holiday release, I believe, and it is somewhat of a full face palette. Nice formula, looks pretty. This is the NARS Dual Intensity eyeshadow palette. This was a new formula. This is a great palette. Lots of great color payoff with these little accent colors. All right, I have a full face palette from Kevyn Aucoin. This is the Jewel Pop. A really lovely little palette, although some of the color eyeshadows don't have as great a payoff as you would come to expect. I know this is just a little duo, but I really kind of secretly love this little duo. I just love the combination of like this taupey color and this dark teal. You can do a lot with those, just those two colors. We're going to look at some Kat Von D. This is the Shade and Light eyeshadow palette. This layout I thought was very smart as well. It has like a very neutral, a cool, and a warm section. You know, new to makeup, this was a nice layout to help you, and it was all matte, so that was really pretty spectacular. I have the matte metal palette, which is amazing. All of these are matte, and these are all like really shiny metal formula. If you want a colorful palette, this is the one you should reach for. Obviously, it's not available anymore. This is the Spellbinding eyeshadow book. I think she had these laid out in like duos, so you could kind of pair them that way, or you could just, you know, use your imagination. I appreciate it when they do try and do some pairings for you to help you, especially when you're working with unusual colors. This is just a mix-up of eyeshadow palettes from the drugstore. This is the Milani Soft and Sultry palette. This is the e.l.f. Nude Rose palette. I have two of the Rimmel Magnificent Eyes. One is the Smoke Edition, and this, I think, was renamed. This one is 01 Keep Calm, but I think it's called the Nude palette now, but it very much favors the original Urban Decay Naked palette, which I think is hysterical. They did that a lot with this brand. Again, here's like the Smoky palette, very similar to the Naked Smoky palette, just a slightly different layout. Here's the purple. Great formula in these, by the way, and what a great buy. Profusion Bear palette, which was part of Emily Noel's Holiday Emily Award Roundup that I tried, and the formula is great. I just don't favor the colors in this palette so much, but also a great buy. This is a sleek palette, oh so special, and it's, good basics. This is the Sonia Kashuk Eye on Nudes palette. Sonia Kashuk has stopped making makeup. It was a nice solid brand at Target. A lot of people love this palette. Here's an oldie. This is the Stila in the Light palette. This is such a great palette. So lovely. This is the Pretty Cool palette from Dose of Colors. One I lusted after and couldn't wait to get my hands on it, but was rather underwhelmed when I finally tried it. I'm not sure where we're going with that baby. Oh, here's another OG favorite. This one from Japanesque. It's the Pixelated Color palette. I feel like I've talked about this on and off over the years. Love it. Just love it so, so much. And at some point in my life, I splurged on this Pat McGrath. This is the Mothership Subliminal 1, I think. I cannot believe that I actually spent that money on this palette. I really wanted to try her formula, and I tried to find a palette that had the most wearable color story in it. And then I was kind of mad after she released these. She started releasing smaller palettes that were so much more affordable. This is the Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette. This is pretty new to my collection. I got it for Christmas, and it's a really awesome palette and a great formula, so I'm very happy with this. Thank you, Kate. This is from Paula's Choice, the Nude Mattes. Just like it says, all nude, all mattes, solid palette. She also has stopped making makeup. She just does skincare now. This is from Aether Beauty. This is the Rose Quartz Crystal Gemstone palette. Gouged my finger in that one right off the bat. Really a beautiful color story and fun to use. Okay, if you can see that logo, this is the KKW Beauty palette. This is Smoky Volume 1. Very basic, neutrals. It's a solid palette. I'm not sure her makeup is worth the hype. This is from Charlotte Tilbury, one of her all-in-one face palettes. And I love the idea of an all-in-one face palette. However, it does lean a little warm. I'm sad about that, but it is beautiful, and I can make it work. And then this one is the Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette. A really super beautiful palette. Does have some warm tones in it, but a good, pretty versatile palette and with some nice little accents. These are phenomenal. These like shimmery, taupey colors. They're great. I upload videos every Saturday morning, and I'll include a link to last week's video right up here, and I will let the YouTube algorithm suggest something else for you, for your viewing pleasure over there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Bye!